Thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning. Just bear with us for a moment as we have everybody come in from the outside. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us. This is the program on education policy and governance at the Harvard Kennedy School. We are hosting our series on school safety. I'd like to introduce at this time our director of the program, Professor Paul Peterson, Henry Lee Shattuck Professor of Government. Paul.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final session in our virtual conference, A Safe Place to Learn. The series is sponsored by the Program on Education Policy and Governance at Harvard University. Recordings for this session and other sessions, all other sessions, can be found on the PEPG website. Thank you for joining us. Following the tragic shooting in Uvalde, Texas, school safety concerns have come to the fore repeatedly in one commentary after another in newspapers across the country. And there's no consensus as to what to do. And we aren't going to be able to explore all the issues in this session, though we have covered quite a few in the sessions that we have already completed, which we encourage you to dig into if you weren't able to attend them. In this session, we're considering two contrasting but perhaps complementary strategies: restorative justice practices and increased use of school resource officers or security agents or police officers, depending on your terminology. We appreciate the work of Antonio Wentland, Nick Tavares, and Michael Poor, who provide the administrative assistance for this conference. And I want to now introduce Daniel Hamlin, a professor of education at the University of Oklahoma. He's an expert on school safety. He's helped organize the conference. He and I will share the duties of moderator during the session today. Daniel, I turn the floor over to you.
All right, thank you, Paul. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. So our first panelist is Catherine Augustine. She's a senior policy researcher at Rand Corporation. She's also a professor of policy analysis at the Pardee Rand Graduate School. And she is an expert on restorative justice, school climate, and socio-emotional learning, to name a few. Our second panelist is Emily Owens. She is a professor in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Society at UC Irvine. She studies a wide range of topics in the economics of crime, including policing, sentencing, and the impact of local public policies on criminal behavior. And finally, we have Ronald Ferguson. He's an economist and a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He's a prolific scholar and has a relatively recent book out. It's called The Formula: Unlocking the Secrets to Raising Highly Successful Children. So here's how the session is going to go. First, we're going to start off with two research presentations. So both Catherine and Emily will present their research, and then Ron will provide some commentary after that. That should leave us about half the session for Q&A. And of course, as always, we encourage you in the audience to post your questions to the panelists. We'll field them and then pose them accordingly. So please do feel free to get involved. We want to make the session as interactive as possible. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to our first panelist, Catherine.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Paul, for having me here today. I really appreciate this conference in general on this critical topic and you having invited me to participate in it. Let's see here. I want to make sure that you all can see my slides. Are they visible?
Yes, they are.
Perfect. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about, as asked to do, a study that we did at Rand quite a few years ago now. The publication came out in 2018, but I think the findings are still relevant in talking about how restorative practices play into school safety. And this was a study done in a medium-sized urban district in which we looked at both the implementation of restorative practices, which I will define for you in a minute in terms of how this district defined it. And we also looked at the impact of those practices. But before I start, I just want to say that Rand and I do other work on school safety, which has helped me think about restorative practices more and their place in this work. You probably know we do a lot of work on gun policy, which has some implications for school safety. We have a working paper out on school-based policing that Emily, you might have seen or be interested in. I'm currently working for the Department of Homeland Security on how to have better and more robust tip lines and threat reporting in general. And for that same agency, we have a couple of reports out on school hardening. And as Daniel said in his introduction of me, I've also done work on what's called school softening. So in other words, improving school climate. I'm looking at 6 districts across the country right now and their efforts at implementing social and emotional learning, for example. And we've done a number of studies at Rand on restorative practices. So there's links in here to these studies, and I think these slides will be available going forward. And the one link I've provided on restorative practices, that's not my study. That's a study that found that they reduced cyberbullying in a study done in Maine. And obviously there are interactions among these separate bullets here. So improving relationships among adults and students, whether it's through social and emotional learning approaches, of which restorative practices can be considered one bucket, can reduce bullying as found in the RAND study. And also there's a lot of research showing that it can encourage threat reporting. So there are relationships here and a reason to look at improving relationships among teachers and students in addition to this study. And in this study, the school district we were studying adopted restorative practices mainly to address suspensions and disparities in them. So there's a lot of evidence on out-of-school suspensions negatively impacting students both in the short term in terms of school dropout and also throughout their lives. And in this particular district, Black students were suspended at a higher rate than white students. They received longer punishments than their white peers, sometimes for the same offenses, even in the same schools, and they were referred to the office more often for minor infractions. So this district wanted to address this and chose restorative practices as that vehicle. So they applied for funding from the Department of Justice, which they received. And their theory was, this district, their theory was that if they could use restorative practices to improve relationships among students and between students and teachers, and therefore improving school climate. And I use those terms interchangeably, improving relationships and improving school climate. Then students would be less likely to misbehave. They would have a better understanding of the impact of their behavior through conversations they would have with peers. And they would also have a better relationship with adults. So they might be felt to be held accountable for their actions in ways that don't necessarily happen. And this was a 2-year initiative, and arguably that's a very short time frame. There was an outside implementer, and then RAND was the evaluator. And we used a randomized controlled trial, splitting 44 schools into 222 halves. And it's important to note that this district didn't do away with suspensions. It still suspended kids, and it saw back then, and it still sees today, restorative practices as an accompaniment to suspensions. So for example, if 2 students fight, the district will hold what's called a conference with those students so that they each have an opportunity to explain what happened, why it happened, how it made them feel. And then 2 things happen after that. One is the suspension, the normal accountability for fighting, and the other is some kind of restoration. So those 2 students might need to stay after school once the suspension period is over and paint a part of the school building together, or work with a teacher in a classroom on grading or improving their filing system or some such thing. So that is the way that restorative practices were used alongside more traditional disciplinary actions, which they hoped they wouldn't need as much because relationships would be better. Okay, so staff capacity was built in a pretty intense way. They had a lot of professional development on restorative practices with high staff take-up. Each school was assigned a coach who visited that school twice a year, and observed teachers using restorative practices, modeled the practices, gave the teachers feedback, and other adults, social workers, counselors, et cetera. And then the teachers and some of those other adults met once a month in what could be described as like a book club. They were reading about restorative practices and then coming together to talk about what they had read and how restorative practices were going in their classrooms. And so what do I mean here by restorative practices? Well, in this district, what they did is hold two kinds of circles. One is called a proactive circle, and the other one either a reactive or restorative circles. And they did both of these kinds of circles on a regular basis. We surveyed the teachers at the end of those 2 years, and they reported using restorative circles and proactive circles often on our scale. And they also, what that meant was on average, teachers were implementing these circles twice a week. And so proactive circles are designed to build community. So an example might be that at the beginning of a semester, a teacher might take the first class period to have a circle to talk about what the classroom norms will be for the rest of that semester. Are they going to raise their hands to ask questions, shout out answers, et cetera? They'll come up with a list of those norms together. So that's an example of a proactive circle. A restorative circle is used in response to an altercation that might happen in the classroom and in the school in general, out on the playground, even in the community. If something's happening in a classroom, for example, if the teacher notices disrespect between students, the teacher might say, okay, let's circle up, get the kids in a circle and give them an opportunity to talk about what was happening and why and how that altercation made them feel. The use of restorative practices was highest in elementary grades, although use did increase in middle and high school grades from year 1 to year 2. So what did we see? We did see some positive impacts when we looked at our outcomes analyses, and they were particularly seen at the elementary level. So capacity building efforts were successful, which is not an outcome, but I do want to say that through our surveying, we saw that staff understood restorative practices. The vast majority bought into them, thought that they were working and were useful, and used them, as I've said. And then teachers in the treatment schools reported better behavior management, better working conditions for themselves, and better learning conditions for the students. And teachers also reported that restorative practices were indeed improving relationships between students and teachers. In the elementary schools, the kids had higher attendance rates, which might be an indicator of an improved climate. And their main goal, this district's main goal of declining suspension rates was realized. So there were fewer suspensions, shorter suspensions, and fewer repeat suspensions, and disparities by race and also by income narrowed over the course of this initiative. Now, this was really driven by improvements at the elementary level. And we also saw that there were null findings as well as negative impacts. So we didn't see any impact on suspensions for violence or weapons. So those behaviors were not declining, and nor on arrests, as you might imagine if we didn't see a decline in suspensions for those behaviors. Neither did we see an impact on suspensions for middle or high school students. So our findings were really driven by what we saw at the elementary level. The treatment students reported actually worse classroom management and less peer support in those classes. Now, when we looked at which teachers reported using restorative practices, that difference went away, but that look at teachers' self-reports is not an experimental analysis. We also saw that test scores worsened in schools, but in schools with predominantly African-American student populations. We didn't see this in schools with predominantly white student populations, which we have some theories about, but we can't demonstrate through our analyses why that's the case. So I just have a few conclusions here, and I will look forward to your questions. I do think that implementing interventions to improve relationships like restorative practices is associated with several benefits. We found fewer out of school suspensions. The number of days suspended declined by 16%, as well as decreased disparities. The other RAND study saw less bullying from those engaged in restorative practices. And there have been other studies showing that there's more threat reporting happening in places where there are better relationships between students and staff. But implementing restorative practices in this particular study was associated with negative outcomes as well. And so some schools and districts moving forward are trying not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. They don't want to stop in their attempts to improve relationships among students and with teachers, but they might be looking at our findings and saying, maybe test scores went down because there were two, restorative and two proactive circles every week, and maybe there was less math being taught. So many schools are trying to think of how can they improve these relationships without taking up as much time to do so, which of course schools need more time for everything, right? But at any rate, some teachers are greeting students at the door as they come in, giving them eye contact, maybe even a personalized greeting or handshake as a way to show them that they're welcomed and they're respected and they're valued in the classroom. Other teachers are doing those longer proactive circles at the beginning of a semester, like I described, but then doing shorter check-in and check-out circles across the school year, not as many as were happening in this study. So I will stop there, and I look forward to your questions, and I look forward to hearing about Emily's study and seeing how it might relate to this one. So thank you.
All right, thank you. So Emily, I'll let you take it away.
Sure. All right. So I'll share my screen. And, I want to start my presentation by specifying what I think the high level outcome should be when we're thinking about placing police officers in schools. Now, we tend to evaluate police more generally by looking at crime. And I don't think that we always ask why crime is the outcome of a change that's going to increase police presence in any particular area. Now, when we're talking about schools and the relationship between schools and local police, we care about crime and violence because crime damages communities. And in the case of schools in particular, crime really prevents schools from helping kids turn into high-functioning adults. And in order to make this point, I think it's actually really useful to compare work done by Patrick Sharkey at Princeton and Desmond Eng at the Harvard Kennedy School. So Sharkey examined how Black children performed on basic vocabulary tests that were administered in their Chicago homes in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And what's key here is that kids in the same neighborhoods were surveyed at different times, meaning that the salience of these children's exposure to an incidence of violence varied across kids living in roughly the same place. And basically what he found was that when kids had their vocabulary assessed a few days after there was a homicide on their block, it looked like their vocabulary, their knowledge of language actually got worse compared to their neighbors who were assessed either right before that homicide occurred or like a month later. Now, if police officers in schools can make these schools safer environments and reduce the amount of violence that kids are exposed to, what Sharkey's results show us is that this can actually help children learn. At the same time, though, I think Desmond Eng's recent research highlights that it's also important to be honest about the fact that police officers have the capacity to inflict, not just prevent violence. And, we grant police officers the legal authority to use deadly force in certain situations. We grant police officers the legal authority to arrest us. But, even sort of fully in policy and sort of justified force used by police can interrupt the development of human capital in the same way that criminal violence does. Now, what Desmond Eng evaluated was the impact of different types of homicides on the GPAs of LA public school students who lived within a half mile of either a criminal homicide that occurred or a police killing. And what he found was that exposure to violence is bad for kids' human capital accumulation, their ability to learn, sort of full stop. But it also actually appears to be the case that being exposed to one police killing may be a bit more detrimental to students' ability to perform well in school than being exposed to one criminal homicide. And this is consistent with the idea that when violence is being caused by an authority figure like a police officer, that can actually be substantively more disruptive to a child than when the assailant is, unknown or a non-authority figure. And what the combination of these two pieces of research suggests to me is that police officers, because of their ability to reduce crime, can help kids develop into productive adults. However, there's also the potential for police officers to impede that development. Now, if placing school resource officers, sworn law enforcement officials inside schools, increases the exposure that kids are going to have to violence or force used by police officers, even when that violence is not criminal, if it's fully within an officer's rights and really authority, I think we need to think about how that's going to offset the beneficial impact that SROs are simultaneously providing by reducing the exposure that children have to peer violence. So when we talk about evaluating school resource officers, I think crime is an important way to measure the benefit of this particular police strategy, but crime can't be the end of the analysis because we really care about kids. So my own research on school resource officers really confirms this sort of ambiguity and complicated relationship between school resource officers and the school environment. And the first point I want to make is that, it's actually really not easy to estimate the causal impact of placing a police officer, a school resource officer, in a school, on the school environment, on school safety. And this is because school resource officers tend to be in bigger schools, schools where there's more of a concern about safety and violence. And in fact, if you were to take Department of Education data and compare the number of crimes that principals know about in schools that have SROs versus schools that do not have SROs, what you would find is that, on average, schools that have more SROs tend to have more violent crime. They tend to have more property crime, more incidents where students are found with drugs, and more incidents where students are found with weapons. All right. Now, this shows us that SROs are generally placed in places where we are concerned about crime, but it doesn't actually tell us if we were to take a school and change the number of SROs in that same school, what would happen. In order to address this, I took advantage of a grant program administered by the Department of Justice, the Cops in Schools program. So through the Department of Justice, local school districts and local police departments were able to receive federal funding to hire a police officer who would exclusively be placed in schools. This was called the Cops in Schools program. And during the Clinton administration, these grants were given out pretty freely, and it was given out in a way that was generally unrelated to underlying trends in crime in schools. Now, what I found was that when you compared schools who received one more federally funded school resource officer, a Cops in Schools resource officer, per about 10,000 residents, these schools reported a roughly 10% reduction in violence, property, and weapons incidents in their schools. Right? So this is a good thing, right? These Cops in Schools officers appeared to make the schools they were working in safer. At the same time, though, I think we also need to think about how these improvements in school safety were achieved, right? And in order to address that, I took a look at the number of arrests that the local police departments in this school jurisdiction made of children, both in school grounds and outside of school grounds. Right. So what I found is that when these same schools received additional officers through the Cops in Schools program, if you were to look at high school students, the arrest rate of young adults between 15 and 19 years old, what we observed is that places that had more Cops in Schools officers tended to arrest more young adults for drug offenses. And what's interesting here is you saw this increase in arrest rate for drug offenses that occurred on school grounds as well as outside of school grounds. Now, this actually suggests that having a school resource officer may improve relationships between police and the community, because we see this increased arrest rate for things that are happening outside of school as well as in school. However, when we look at younger children, all right, how many elementary and middle school students are arrested by local police departments when there are more school resource officers? Well, what we observe is that, having one additional cops and schools officer per 10,000 residents is associated with a, 20 to 30% increase in the arrest rates of children between the ages of 7 and 14, right, for crimes that are happening in schools. Now, I think that some of these arrests, may have actually increased school safety, but I think we need to have a real policy discussion about whether or not a 7-year-old should ever be arrested for anything, right? Let alone a property offense or a drug offense. And that leaves me with this question about what practitioners should do about this data, right? About these findings. And for me, I think the most important data-driven recommendation that can be made about the proper role of police in schools is that it's subtle. And really, school districts and police departments need to be more transparent about where SROs are and what SROs are doing. Qualitative research on school resource officers, as well as large-scale policy analysis that I have done, and also Emily Weisburst at UCLA has done, has really shown that there's likely a lot of variation in what SROs are doing across school districts, and as a result, how much they're really promoting overall student learning. Now, like most police training, there's actually very little evidence on what the appropriate hiring strategies, screening strategies, and training strategies should be for SROs. And that's because data on SRO training and SRO placement is currently not collected or made available to outside researchers at the school or officer level. Instead, what we observe are horrific instances where police officers in schools don't behave the way we as a society would want them to behave. And this kind of thing is something that's going to keep happening unless we start to seriously evaluate SRO hiring, training, and placement practices with the same level of empirical rigor that we currently use to evaluate teachers in the classroom.
All right, thank you very much. Ron? Oh, Ron, you're muted.
Okay, I need it now.
Yes, thank you.
All right. A few fairly disjoint reactions or thoughts in response to what I just heard. First, I listened to the presentation that Chancellor David Banks gave in the opening ceremony of this conference, I guess I can call it, multi-day conference. And he said, in quote, building the right culture in schools is probably the most important thing you can do. And I'm kind of going to build off of that notion a little bit. I noticed that Catherine talked about relationships and climate. She kind of avoided the word culture. Culture is a dangerous word, but it's an important word. And I think there's a set of norms in any social context that govern the decisions people make about what to do. And you may know, I'm an economist. The motivation in economics is utility maximization, which is totally unsatisfactory. So I ran over to the psychology, and in motivational psychology, you can boil it down to a need for belonging, a sense of belonging, need for a sense of competence, a need for a sense that you have some power and influence. And I like to add to that a sense of security, right? And the idea is that people gravitate to opportunities to experience competence and belonging and influence and security. And so a lot of the misbehavior that we see in schools is driven by kids seeking these sources of fulfillment, seeking to feel a sense of belonging and competence and influence. And restorative justice is a way to set up a social dynamic to provide more of that sense of belonging and competence and influence by paying attention to kids and listening to kids and and embracing them to some degree. But at the same time, when you do that, when you make them feel more comfortable, you can also create an environment that's a little more relaxed. And so I think some of the negative effects that Catherine was talking about are coming off the kids feeling a little bit more comfortable in school. So you aren't on your best behavior all the time because you're not as afraid as you were before, the adults, because they're kind of nicer now, right? And so I find that result in my own research. We have what we call the 7 C's of effective teaching, right? Care, confer, captivate, clarify, consolidate, classroom management, and challenge. And we find that holding everything else constant, when you increase care, you slightly reduce classroom management or the orderliness of the classroom. And it's a very strong statistical result. And so I think some of the effects that we're finding with restorative justice may be becoming, because the environment is a little less intimidating. You know, they give you a little more rope before you get in trouble. And you know, even if you do get in trouble, the punishment is not going to be as harsh. And so there's a rational decision process that goes on there. So I want to make that as one point. Another point is that Catherine said, you know, kids are treated differently. There's a disproportionality issue, both within and between schools. There's very little research that allows you to distinguish the degree to which disproportionality is a within school as opposed to a between school phenomenon. There's one study by Russell Skiba and 6 other authors. And it's interesting, Skiba is probably the most well-known person for writing about disproportionality. And a lot of his work is written with the presumption that a lot of it is within school. But probably the best data set they had was a whole state worth of data where they were able to distinguish within school versus between school differences and the likelihood you would be suspended if conditional on having been referred to the principal. So among kids who had been referred to the principal, it turned out that the likelihood of being suspended was entirely a between school phenomenon, that in terms of the disproportionality. The higher percentage Black kids in a school, the more likely anybody was to be suspended if they got in trouble. And this is a study by, the title of the study is Parsing Disproportionality, Parsing Disciplinary Disproportionality, Contributions of Infraction, Student, and School Characteristics to Out-of-School Suspension and Expulsion. It's published in the American Educational Research Journal in 2014. And it's the only study I've found that really, well, actually there's another study that does it for special education placements, but this is the only one I've seen that really parses the within versus between for discipline. And it has implications for how we think about what the solutions are. Because if particularly for the racial disproportionality, my read of this result is that there's suspension rates are higher in environments where it's more difficult to manage behavior. And I find very systematically that the higher percentage Black kids in a school, the more misbehavior there is, the harder it is to manage it. And that's probably why there's more suspension, because it's just got to get them out of the building. We don't have enough counselors to sit down and figure out what they're thinking and help them solve their problem. We just need to get them out of here. And I think there's a degree to which Black kids in particular, and Black males in particular, are trapped in a pernicious peer culture. And it's not anybody's fault. It's just kind of the situation. You walk into it and it's already there. There's a set of expectations with regard to what you need to do to really be cool, to really fit in with the group. And I want to share just a little bit of data to drive this point a little bit. I'm going to share my screen. Wait a minute, let me get the right thing on the screen first. Wait a minute. I had it set up and then I closed it. Oh, there it is right there. Sorry, I had this all set up and then I went to, okay, now I've got it here. Okay, you can see my screen now, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, These are data from about 290 middle and high schools. Some of you may know I founded what's called Tripod Education Partners. We do a ton of survey work in school systems. And so on the horizontal axis, you'll see we've got schools in 4 different groups. Schools that are 0 to 25% students of color, 25 to 50, 50 to 75, 75 to 100. And then you've got each of the bars for white, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, and Black within each of those cells. And the height of the bar represents the percentage of kids who sometimes, usually, or always do things they don't want to do because of pressure from other students. Okay, so this is kids doing things they don't want to do because of pressure from other students. We see for Black males, even in schools that are 0 to 25% students of color, they're up over 35%. They're at least sometimes doing things they really don't want to do. And we see that as the percentage goes up in terms of percent students of color, all the groups tend to go up in terms of doing things they don't want to do. And so we talk about trying to influence kids' behavior. Sometimes we treat it as if they are choosing to do the misbehavior because they really wanted to do that particular misbehavior. And it might be just because they just were trying to fit in. They didn't even want to do it. And so you're preaching to the choir when you're trying to explain to them why they shouldn't have done it. They knew they shouldn't have done it. They didn't even want to do it. But it's more scary to get punished by your friends for not doing what they thought you should have done that was cool. And there's a phenomenon called pluralistic ignorance, where people misread one another's preferences and conform their own behavior to what they think other people would think is cool. You can have a whole community doing something nobody wants to do but everybody thinks everybody else wants to do it. And I think youth peer culture often has this feature to it. Kids are doing stuff they all know is wrong. None of them really want to do it, but they're trying to fit in and they think everybody else thinks it's cool. And so this is just one little piece of evidence bearing on this issue. Here's another one. At this school, I must be ready to fight to defend myself. Okay. And so here you get the majority students of color, you're up over 60% of kids are saying they have to at least be sometimes prepared to fight to defend themselves. And I know a theme in this work is that a lot of the violence and carrying weapons and so on is defensive. It's not offensive, it's defensive. And this has to do with that particular issue. But the notion that kids are trapped in their culture does tell us we do need to work on culture, and restorative justice does do that. It does help us to work on school culture. And just a word about the school resource officers, then I'll stop and we can have more discussion. I'm currently doing a project with a large school system on parent engagement, and we have surveyed each stakeholder group of the school community, the principals, the teachers, the non-teaching staff, and the security officers are among the non-teaching staff, and then we also have the bus drivers. Okay. When it comes to office secretaries or office support and security officers, and you look at the open responses, because you have a combination of forced choice and open response, there are 0 positive open responses about security officers. Okay, it's always it's complaining about the degree to which they abuse their power. You know, really being verbally abusive to parents in front of their kids, those kinds of things, being unnecessarily uncooperative with parents. And so this notion that police and security officers may add to the trauma, some of that is kind of coming through in what we're picking up out of these interviews and surveys. And so, but the bottom line is that human beings gravitate toward doing those things that give them a sense of belonging, a sense of competence, a sense of influence. And we need to shape school cultures that will give them those feelings from doing things that are socially positive. Okay. And all these different frameworks can be understood, I think, through that same lens. We're trying to shape the incentive environment to have something that provides something that's collectively productive. So I'll stop with that.
All right.
Thank you, Ron. That's, your comments remind me of something James Coleman wrote so long ago about the same thing, really, about schools think they're teaching kids, but really schools are places where kids are trying to relate to one another, and the teachers are pretty much a sideshow. So I think that's a really fundamentally important point about a school. That's the way it is. But he was talking mostly about high schools. And you would think that, maybe this restorative justice idea is particularly valuable in the high school environment. But now if we take Catherine's findings and think about them, she's finding that the effectiveness of this intervention seems to be greatest at the elementary level. I don't know if you got your negative findings on student educational performance, test score performance, whether that was true at the elementary level or not. But you want to comment on that, Catherine, and on Ron's comments and how your study fits in with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the negative impacts on achievement that we saw were in grades 3 through 5. So they were not at the high school level. We also have limitations in terms of our high school data because we didn't end up having baseline equivalence between treatment and control. But I will say that we saw, so I'm going to move away from talking about experimental and talk about the qualitative work we did for a second, because we were in these schools every week observing uses of restorative practices. And we saw both extremes at the high school level. So we saw some really cool things happening. There was one high school, for example, where there was an assignment in which the kids had to break up into groups and create their own cities with their own laws. And one group created a law that no homosexuals could live in their city. And there was, the teacher was concerned and didn't know how to respond, and brought in another student who had really taken to the idea of restorative practices and had created what he called a peace club. And she brought him in. So this is another high school student, to have a circle with the students in the classroom to talk about that law that was created by that group and the impact it had on the other students. And that group ended up not having that law anymore for that assignment. But reportedly, there were other ramifications of that circle, those conversations. That one person, that student who had founded that peace club, has gone on to talk about restorative practices. He is a gay Black student, and he talks about the impact restorative practices has had on him, on his friends, his family, his community. A really moving, story to hear him talk about it. And I have no doubt that his work in that school had a ripple effect on other students and on building community. There were other high schools in which, in full disclosure, my daughter is a high school student in this district. And there are other students who say things like, when teachers ask them to circle up and talk, they're weak. They don't know how to discipline us or how to manage the classroom, so they do a circle instead. So there really are both. It's hard to say whether they work or not in high school. It's so dependent on the culture in the classroom, the skill of the teacher, the authenticity of what he or she is saying, how the students react. But I can say with confidence that we saw it both work well and both not work so well in the high school setting.
If I might follow up with that. So I'm kind of curious about this trade-off that Ron suggests. So when you implement restorative justice, maybe it creates a more lax academic environment, and that it partly explains the negative outcomes you see on academics. But I'm thinking back to New York City, and one of the main controversies there related to restorative justice is that it actually has harmful effects on other learners, that students do something severe on school grounds and then they're back in the classroom. And so it creates a little bit of an environment of fear for those who are, maybe doing just fine in school, let's say, or not involved with those types of things. So where do you kind of fall?
Can I comment on that?
Yeah. And is there trade-off here?
In our data, we have one item, the way my classmates behave gets in the way of our learning. The way our classmates behave gets in the way of our learning. And the higher percent Black kids, frankly, in the classroom, the more agreement is with that. That variable in combination with some others on kid behavior is the strongest predictor in our data of value-added achievement gains. Okay, so the behavior management, behavior environment. I mean, I come sort of to the conclusion that the greatest denial of access to educational equity today is access to an orderly classroom, right? And so there are teachers who can manage, who can have an orderly classroom in almost any school, but it takes more skill if you've got a lot of kids in your classroom who don't live with their fathers and have all this other stuff going on. So we've got to prepare teachers to work effectively with the kids who are presented to them, and it can be done. But if they are not sufficiently prepared and you have a disorderly classroom, you don't get as much learning done. And the restorative justice, handled well by somebody whose skill is probably fantastic, handled not so well by somebody who's doesn't quite know how to do it, and they kind of ease up a little bit and the classroom becomes a little disorderly, then you can have negative effects on achievement, even if you have positive effects on happiness.
So I hear you all saying, yeah, well, go ahead, Emily, you have a comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that just building on that, you know, when Dr. Ferguson was talking about his survey of school students, and how school, in the school that, was it one school or multiple schools that you
This
were?
is 290 schools in the data I was showing you.
Yeah, okay, so this sort of universally negative assessment of school resource officers, and particularly the interactions with the parents, I thought was so interesting.
What I was talking about school resource officers is one school district.
Okay, so one school district. Yeah, all right. So that, you know, that is not something that is the, you know, really even original intent of the school resource officer program going back to the 60s and 70s. And it's really in contrast with some other research done by Samantha Viano at George Mason, who's looked at a different school district, right? Where the school resource officers in there's a small city and suburban district where she was interviewing, you know, teachers and administrators and school resource officers, actually highlighted instances where the school resource officers were aware of problems at home, right? Or actually that a child's parent was incarcerated, and the school resource officer was able to step in and be a positive role model for that child, right? And so it leads to this interesting situation where, particularly if what you want is, you know, a sense of order, of guidance, of providing structure, school resource officers can provide that. They also cannot. And what we need to do is figure out, you know, how was it the school resource officers were able to productively use their authority and the stature that we give them, right, as role models in a way that's positive. And how did that contrast with the training and hiring and selection procedures that were used in the other school district that you studied, Dr. Ferguson, right? Like that's, because I think we would all like police officers to be serving this role at helping, being another toolkit that teachers can use to keep environments calm so that students are learning. We don't know that.
You mentioned that the school district that had the positive was sort of a suburban, kind of more middle classy place.
Yep, and maybe
the one
that's
that I'm talking about is more blue collar, inner city kind of. Now the aspiration is to flip the culture here to be more like the one you described.
Yeah.
But sometimes when you have a lot of families that are in turmoil in the district, the risk that the next parent who comes to the door is really out of order is greater. And so just like the policeman who's afraid to go into the dangerous stop because he's not sure what he's going to find, you probably have these security officers more on edge just because it's a riskier environment.
That's
so
possible.
Ron, this is this is very much the theory of the no excuses school, the charter school movement, the KIPP movement, and many of the other no excuses school organizations out there. They're saying, you know, we got to create this climate. You be nice, but you also have to work hard. So they're trying to sort of, you know, get both of these things, saying we're going to have very high expectations for you. We really expect you to perform well, but at the same time, we want you to be respectful of your fellow students. And they have the great advantage of being able to be choice schools. So they're only going to get the kind of students who are going to be coming from families that are ready to accept that kind of environment. And I hear all of you saying things that are touching on that same point. So is this one of the great advantages of the charter schools that are
Just let me say
much
quickly,
higher levels of achievement?
part of what Chancellor Banks said in that comment is that he's also found fantastic schools that are not charter schools. Okay, I used to every year rank schools by value added in Massachusetts, and the charter schools are right up there at the top, but so were a bunch of public schools that nobody ever knew about or paid attention to. So there is something about the school leadership and school management that's really important that you do find in the better charter schools. You also find better charter schools that don't have it. And so I think creating conditions of that foster the kind of culture we want, it's a leadership issue. And the leadership can be exercised in different environments, and there are cases where charters make it easier to establish that environment.
Yeah, and I will add that, KIPP, which is a group of charter schools that has been found to be effective, require parent pledges on a number of things. So not just the way discipline will be handled, but also on kids engaging in education until 6 p.m. During the summer, sometimes on the weekend. So there are a lot of reasons, in my opinion, why KIPP is effective. But I just wanted to come back to answering one of Daniel's questions. So in our study, we did not find that suspensions went down in the middle grades, and that's where we saw the negative impact on achievement in particular. So our study is not showing that the reason why achievement goes down is that poorly behaving kids are staying in the classroom. Our study doesn't say why achievement went down in those treatment schools. I'm really attracted, Ron, to your theory that where we saw this is in majority Black schools. That's where we saw it.
Yeah.
Now, my thinking had been that teachers in those schools were spending more time on circles than on instructing in math, but it could also be that teachers were juggling multiple disciplinary actions and it wasn't as easy for them to implement the restorative practices that they had been trained on.
It may also be that they were nicer. They became nicer. Okay.
Right.
And when they become nicer, the kids become a little more relaxed. Don't have to push quite as hard. They give one of our items has to do with clearing up confusion. If they're being nicer, you kind of give kids the answer more quickly, which means they don't have to puzzle over it as long. And so there's a bunch of really subtle issues that have to do with effort. Okay. And so there may be a negative effect on effort because of this kinder environment that's coming along with restorative justice.
Yeah, that might be. I hadn't thought about that only because they were still suspending kids, so they hadn't replaced traditional discipline with restorative practices. But
this is a different issue than traditional discipline, though.
Right,
It's about the climate.
Exactly. You're talking about the way they're interacting with the kids is different, which right. I haven't thought enough about. So that's very helpful.
I was wondering if we could turn to Emily's study for a minute. So Emily, when I look at the results for school crime reduction in your study, it seems like the magnitude of the findings are kind of small. Is that your interpretation of the results? And then does that kind of lead you to think about, well, is this investment actually worth it given the small reductions in school crime?
Yeah, particularly given the typical size of a Cops in Schools grant, this, a typical grant was associated with like a 1% to 2% reduction in violent crime. A very large grant would have sort of a 10% reduction in school safety. Is that something that's worth it in terms of school safety, or worth the investment? That's really the $1 million question, right? I think that this comes up particularly when we hear, results like Dr. Augustine's, where, sometimes restorative justice can be positive, but not always, right? In terms of improving school safety. I think that police officers with their presence, do tend to have a pretty measurable and consistent positive impact on violence. And I'm being careful about the words that I'm using, right? Violence and property. I don't want to say safety, right? Because I want to think about safety as the total sort of comfort level that children have. But in terms of criminal behavior, police officers do reduce crime. It seems like that's sort of something that's true across many, many contexts. But I agree, these aren't like the largest reductions that I've ever seen, and they do come at this cost, right? Where there is the possibility that the negative impact of this increase in arrests, particularly for young children, sort of outweighs those benefits. Emily Weisburst's research that I didn't put on up in my slides does an interesting sort of net effect analysis where she looks at subsequent high school graduation rates for children in Texas who were exposed to school resource officers funded by the Cops in Schools program. So we can think about that as truly, a quasi experiment. And she found that middle school students who were exposed to school resource officers funded through the Cops program were actually less likely to graduate, which suggests that in Texas, that sort of net effect of, perhaps their schools were safer, but there was potentially more police contact was not positive for those students, right? So that's what we know in Texas. Again, in my study, I looked at racial disparities and was not able to find evidence of them, but I was limited to the National Instance-Based Reporting System, which sort of disproportionately, at the time I was looking at it, includes smaller districts that are whiter. There just aren't many urban school districts or school districts with large Black or non-white populations. So I couldn't really approach that. But your question is the right one. Is this worth it? And we need more school districts willing to tell researchers where SROs are so that we can connect them to education data and really think about when they're worth it and when they're not.
And so we're running up to the hour here, but I want to ask a question that I think lurks behind both of these interventions that you have been talking about, and also is relevant to Ron's comments, and that is how difficult it is to come up with policies which on the ground will actually succeed. They may sound good in theory and wonderful ideas. And I think you can see the logic behind both of these ideas. We need to have safety officers on the ground in the school watching for bad things that might happen. And we need to have communication among students and letting students really converse with one another and see if we can't work out the conflicts that develop in that kind of a setting. Both of these sound like terrific ideas, but you've got to get the right people and they got to put it in place in the right way. And that's just a huge organizational problem, especially when adults find it so difficult to control student behavior, teenage behavior, which is a dynamic environment there that adults find it very difficult to penetrate. Any comments?
We could probably go around the horn and give everyone about 30 seconds each.
Yeah.
Something that's very promising in police training is training that exploits procedural justice, that really instructs officers or provides officers with tools to make better decisions in high stakes situations. There's an increasingly large number of experimental studies that show that on the streets, this can help police officers reduce crime, but also make fewer discretionary events and use force less. And I think it would be very promising to explore this type of procedurally justice-based sort of slow thinking training for school resource officers and see if that can help school resource officers provide the benefits without some of the costs that they can in schools.
Catherine?
Well, the devil is in the details when it comes to implementation. I mean, we could talk about that forever and give you loads of examples of things that work well in one setting, but not in another, well in a small sort of controlled environment and not in the real world. I don't think that means we shouldn't try, and we shouldn't try to replicate interventions with promise. And I think we do know more about how to better support teachers, whether we have the resources to provide them with the training and support that we think would work is an entirely different question.
Right. And I think bottom line, implementation, we can do implementation well, but you got to do it on purpose and with planning and with time, and just realizing that pretty much all the effective things we do are based on the same set of fundamental principles of human development. And they just have to be scaffolded well with adequate support for folks. The other thing I just wanted to mention, particularly with the SROs, is that the most important impacts maybe at the tails of the distribution, and like crises that are avoided that don't show up in the measure of average impact. And so that one school shooting that's avoided because you had an SRO in the right place at the right time to avoid it. And so there's some just logic that should affect our decision-making beyond anything that we can firmly establish with the data.
All right, well, thank you to the panelists for a highly engaging session. We really appreciate you taking time. And thank you also to the audience for joining us for these 6 sessions. Again, just to remind you, the recordings for all of the sessions are available through the PEPG website. So thank you again.
Thank you all.
Thank you.